The U.S. Constitution guarantees Americans numerous liberties and rights. In this module, we will define and distinguish civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties are freedoms that are guaranteed to the individual. The guarantees take the form of restraints on government. For example, the First Amendment declares that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Civil liberties declare what the government cannot do. In contrast, civil rights declare what the government must do or provide. Civil rights are powers and privileges that are guaranteed to the individual and protected against arbitrary removal at the hands of the government or other individuals. The right to vote and the right to a jury trial in criminal cases are civil rights embedded in the Constitution. Today, civil rights also embrace laws that further certain values. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, for example, furthered the value of equality by establishing the right to non-discrimination in public accommodations and the right to equal employment opportunity. The Bill of Rights lists both civil liberties and civil rights. When we refer to the rights and liberties of the Constitution, we mean the protections that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights and in the first section of the 14th Amendment. The list includes freedom of religion, freedom of speech and of the press, the rights to assemble peaceably and to petition the government, the right to bear arms, the rights of the criminally accused, the requirement of due process, and the equal protection of the laws. In Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, it states, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or prosperity without due process of law." Most freedoms protected in the Bill of Rights today function as limitations on the states, and many of the standards that limit the national government serve equally to limit state governments. The changes have been achieved through the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The clause has two central meanings. First, it requires the government to adhere to appropriate procedures. Second, it forbids unreasonable government action. The Supreme Court has used the first meaning of the Due Process Clause as a sponge, absorbing or incorporating the procedural specifics of the Bill of Rights and spreading or applying them to the states. The history of due process cases reveals that unlikely litigants often champion constitutional guarantees and that freedom is not always the victor. Congress enacted the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, to provide full civil rights to African Americans. In the late 19th century, however, the Supreme Court interpreted the amendments very narrowly, declaring that they did not restrain individuals from denying civil rights to African Americans and that they did not apply to the states. The court's rulings had the effect of denying the vote to most African Americans and of institutionalizing racism, making racial segregation a fact of daily life. Through a series of court cases spanning 2 decades, the court slowly dismantled segregation in the schools. The battle for desegregation culminated in the Brown versus Board of Education cases in 1954 and 1955, in which a now supportive Supreme Court declared segregated schools to be inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. The court also ordered the desegregation of all schools and upheld the use of busing to do so. The civil rights movement was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who believed strongly in civil disobedience and nonviolence, strategies that helped secure for African Americans equality in voting rights, public accommodations, higher education, housing, and employment opportunity. In fact, civil rights activism and the civil rights movement worked to the benefit of all minority groups. Native Americans obtained some redress for past injustices. Hispanic Americans came to recognize the importance of group action to achieve economic and political equality. Disabled Americans won civil rights protections, and civil rights legislation removed the protectionism that was, in effect, legalized discrimination against women in education and employment. Government and businesses instituted affirmative action programs to counteract the results of past discrimination. These provide preferential treatment for women, minorities, and the disabled in a number of areas that affect individuals' economic opportunity and well-being. In effect, such programs discriminate to remedy earlier discrimination. In sum, the challenge for our democracy is to balance the need for freedom with demands for equality.